Welcome to Coast Vue, the show that every single day celebrates the men and women who are making coastal Mississippi such an amazing place to live, work, and play. Hey, I really enjoyed the show yesterday. We had Senator Jeremy England and we had Jace Payne from the city of Gulfport. Both of them are One Coast recipients. They were top 10 under 40. And just we had great conversations. And, I hope to talk to all 20 of the winners over the course of the next several weeks. And should be just some terrific opportunities to see what's going on in their minds, to talk a little bit about their desire to help raise the bar in coastal Mississippi, and more importantly, the responsibility they feel for having gotten the award and being an example to others and feeling the responsibility to sort of lead by example. It's just terrific opportunity to meet with people and push hard this whole notion of we can never have enough leaders in coastal Mississippi who get it. There was actually an interesting moment in the conversation with Jace Payne where he was talking about how we can't get complacency about what the needs of young people are these days, and he pointed out this whole notion of work-life balance and the stresses that are on a lot of young people today. That after having been home working remotely and having had this opportunity actually to contribute toward helping with the kids or things at home or whatever it might be. It might just be relationship building, but whatever it is, it now sort of factors into their thinking about whether they're going to be happy or not and whether they found satisfaction in work or not. And Kyle and I'll draw Kyle into this conversation at some point because, as you know, we do this show remotely, and we've learned a lot about how to use the technology. There was even a Fox News piece yesterday about the Zoom boom. And it's not going away. The reality is people are continuing to try to find that nice mix between working from home remotely and also going into the office. But there was a study that was done that said over 50% of current employees around the world are either thinking about leaving their job or considering it because they are now sort of wrestling with how do I find work-life, balance so that they can really reach quality of life. Well, with all this as sort of a backdrop, my son, Justin Mathews, who works at Price Waterhouse in New York, I've mentioned him many times on this show. He's been on the show before, wrote a piece, and he asked me to take a look at it. And the name of the piece was Truly Hybrid Way of Working. And I read it, and I was so deeply impressed with what he wrote. I thought I'd invite him to the show, and we can talk about what his thoughts are about this. So before we go any further, let me invite Justin into the conversation. And first of all, I'll say good morning. How are you doing, my son?
Doing well, Dad. Good to be here. Excited to be on the show.
So, so where are you at this very moment?
I am currently working remotely in my apartment in the West Village in the lower part of Manhattan in New York City.
Wow. You love New York, don't you?
I love New York. Yeah, it's a great place to live. Maybe not for everybody, but for me, it's the best.
Well, we've talked about this a little bit, but we'll let everybody in on a little bit of a family conversation we had all along the way. Okay, so Jordan and Tori, my daughter and other son, my daughter's a teacher, Jordan's a lawyer in coastal Mississippi. They go to Southern Miss, where Ann and my wife Ann and I went. And Justin, he enjoyed going to Southern Miss with us, but he was always going to be that kid that says, "I'm not positive I'm going to go to Southern Miss." And along the way, we went to visit our friend Dave Dennis at Auburn. And that visit kind of sealed the deal. And you were still kind of young, but you set it in your head that you were headed to Auburn. You were going to break the Southern Miss mold for the family. And there was no looking back, was there?
That's right. That's right. As soon as I stepped foot on Auburn, I knew that's where I needed to go to school. And best experience of my life. Absolutely loved going to Auburn. War Eagle. And thanks to Dave Dennis, prominent Coast Vue man and member of the community, but yeah, he was the guy that opened the door for me.
So you thought you were going to be an architect. You ended up going into building science, and that's what you initially got your degree in. And you actually worked a couple of summers for construction companies. And like a lot of us who do jobs along our lives, we are thankful we had a chance to do it because it taught us what we didn't want to do. Is that what you learned, Justin?
Yeah, that's right. It's been a constant evolution, I think, of learning what I'm good at, what I'm passionate about, what gifts I have, and what I can offer, and really zeroing in, I think, what my calling is in life. And it was evident that construction is fantastic, and I really love certain components of it. but it wasn't going to check enough boxes for me. So that was led to the initial pivot.
What's ironic about that, as we've discussed so many times before, the opportunity, though, to learn, by the way, the construction science program is one of the top programs in the United States. I mean, I think they have 100% placement coming out of that program. But what you learn is just about every phase of construction, but how to manage projects, really, really complicated, detailed projects. And that having that knowledge has really served you well in the gig you have today with Price Waterhouse, isn't it? Hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has. And I think that's part of the journey, right? Is you do certain things, you feel them out, and you figure out if they're right for you and if they fit kind of your life mission or not. But as you kind of figure things out, you're constantly picking up new tools, putting new tools in the tool belt that ultimately benefit you in the next step and the next step after that, and then eventually for whatever you're really meant to be doing.
So you went back to the master's program. You decided to get a business degree. But what I loved about Auburn, incidentally, was Auburn had a really good process for evaluating students to help you have a better understanding of what it is you might be a better fit in. So you ended up getting an MBA, and you also, which is a big surprise to us, subsequently got a master's in finance as well. But when you put it all together, it sort of helped you kind of come to the realization that at least initially, management consulting would be a really good place for you. And you don't regret it, do you?
No, I think the biggest component that construction was missing for me, and this was the same thing that architecture was missing for me, was the people component. I love people, and a lot of my skills and the way y'all raised me contributes to me being really good at people things. So when I found consulting, I realized it's really just bringing people together to solve important problems, and then managing, relationships and how they interact with each other. So yeah, it was a perfect fit for me, and I found it kind of in that process that they encouraged us to go through in the MBA program of understanding what you like, what you don't like, and really what you're good at. And yeah, that's how I led to consulting. It's been a great blessing in my life, frankly.
So you did essentially an internship while you were at Auburn at Price Waterhouse. That led to a job in Houston, working in the energy sector, and you didn't stay there very long, but tell a little bit about the journey of being in Houston and ending up in New York.
Yeah, so landed in Houston. Was lucky enough that there were some partners that really took me under their wing there, and was the reason I was able to get into PwC in the first place. And yeah, I had a wonderful experience there. And again, on this constant journey of kind of narrowing in what I want to do, I realized that like cash flow management and kind of international cash management was really the thing that piqued my interest in consulting. And so I started getting involved in some projects that were doing that type of work within PwC, which got me connected into the group that does that stuff, which is based out of New York City. And a similar story, right? I was very lucky in that I had mentors and partners that were willing to take me under their wing and really wanted the best for me in my career. And they were like, look, the best thing for you is going to be to move up here in PwC into New York, join our group and really start developing these skills. Which was great because I think ever since we visited New York when I was like maybe 10, it was always like this cool, shiny place that I would love to have lived, but never really felt like a possibility. And yeah, this made it a possibility. And been here for 3 years now and haven't looked back. It's been fantastic.
So for your mom and me, we were never really surprised that you would end up in New York because as you were growing up, you did a mission trip down to the Amazon. You went to Peru and Ecuador, all over Europe. You made a decision to move to Spain, to Madrid, to learn Spanish along the way. We visited you there. Thank God we had you because we learned that they don't have really a second language in Madrid. It's just Spanish. And if you don't know Spanish, you can't even order fast food or get a ride in a cab. What a great experience that was. But it was, you were always going to be our adventurous child. I mean, like, for example, Justin, when he was in Spain, he decided to go to Pamplona to run with the bulls because along the way, as maybe you heard me talk about with Reed Geis, Reed introduced me to Ernest Hemingway along the way. I've read just about everything he's written. I introduced Hemingway to Justin. He's done the same. And he wanted to go to Pamplona and run with the bulls. And when he got there, he didn't just run with the bulls. He got in with some local guys and got at the beginning of the pack and almost got gored in Dead Man's Corner. And the story goes on from there. But He was the guy we were always going to have to hold our breath. So we're actually glad that you landed in New York, and that you're happy there. But you're working on the international team, and you could end up going anywhere in the world. Hey, why don't we do this, Justin? When we come back, we'll continue the conversation. Talk about what life has been like in New York City during the pandemic, and what led to you writing this wonderful piece about truly hybrid way of working. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with my son, Justin Mathews. Welcome back to Coast Vue. One of the things that occurs to me as we talk to my son, Justin Mathews, who is coming to us from New York City, the West Village, where he works for Price Waterhouse, and has recently written a piece on truly hybrid way of working. It occurs to me that I didn't necessarily have to do too much prep for this conversation today. I sort of knew where we needed to go. I pride myself in doing my homework for my guests. I don't want any conversation to be short-circuited in any way just because I didn't find the time to do my homework to get prepared. But in a way, I actually did do my homework because this piece that you wrote that you sent me to look over, I spent a lot of quality time looking at it, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But the piece is extraordinarily well written and really brings into sharp focus this tug of war that's going on in so many people's lives today about how do they find work and life away from work balance. And the pandemic helped people find a quality of life because of their remote working, that now as they sort of try to find the right mix between remote and working from the office, they really are tussling with. And I think this is literally around the world. And Justin's a young person who's sort of come to grips with that. So, hey, Justin, when we went to break, we were talking about you're in New York now, you're in West Village, you're working. Well, how do you describe the work that you do today? What division of Price Waterhouse are you working with? And, kind of give us a sense of that.
Yeah, so I sit within our consulting solutions practice within PwC broadly. And then specifically, I sit within our treasury and working capital management team. And what we primarily focus on is a couple different buckets. One, cash management, so how companies manage their cash. That can be anything from working capital to actual liquidity that's in banks. And then another big portion of it is the deals portion. So what we do is we help companies as they go through transformations or as they go through separations or mergers, really think through how that cash should be managed. So if you think of a big organization is splitting up, there's cash that's entangled there, similar to a divorce or any other breakup, that needs to be separated out. So we advise our clients on how to do that the most efficiently, and how to make sure everybody needs everybody has what they need moving forward to operate. And you can imagine for big global clients that are in almost every country in the world, that conversation gets pretty complicated and convoluted. But it's a fun problem to solve.
Yeah, I remember we were at our hunting camp up outside of Greenwood between Christmas and New Year's, and I got to listen to you do some of your calls, and it was amazing to me. People checking in from all over the country on those calls. Did you ever imagine that you would be dealing with so many different, when you talk about cash transactions, so many different monetary descriptions and so many amazing people from all over the world? That has got to have been and continues to be just a great experience for you.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that it was kind of my goal when I entered PwC to be doing this work. And it hit me the other day, which was kind of written about in this piece, is that I was sitting in this conference room. We were doing our first in-person meeting since the pandemic. And I was sitting in this conference room with about 25 other people all from our client. And I was the most senior PwC person in the room. And we were discussing these complex topics. And what I realized in that moment is that I've kind of hit the goal that I established for myself when I first joined the firm. It was this great moment of satisfaction of, and almost like disbelief of wow, we did it. We're kind of here exactly where we wanted to be. A cool moment of accomplishment. I love what I do to a certain extent. I've really appreciated the work that I've done. It's exciting to know that the steps that have been taken up to this point have gotten to me where I originally wanted to be when I first joined the firm 4 years ago.
What I said earlier in my career, it seemed like I was moving to a different role every couple of years, every 2 or 3 years, something would change. And sometimes I wasn't even looking for it. It just happened. I just stayed focused on what I was doing, and the evolution kind of occurred. But what's interesting is I always said that life's a journey, a journey of self-discovery. I don't care how old you are. Every day is about discovery. You never learn all there is to learn. In fact, the more you learn how much you don't know. That keeps you thirsty. And that reality of trying to figure out, what's the next step? When's the next step? How does that all play together? It's, a lot of people are going through that now. A lot of people are going through. I bet there's been more reflection about work in the midst of the pandemic than ever before. I mean, by single people around the world than ever before in history. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking to your friends in New York and around the world, are they all thinking about the same thing? Just something that's top of mind for them all?
Yeah, I think what the pandemic allowed us to do is take a step back and really reflect on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what it looks like in the future. And I think that's been a really healthy process for a lot of people. I think in my friend group in New York, I'm the only one who hasn't moved jobs since the pandemic. Because I think what there is right now is a lack of comfort in getting comfortable, if that makes sense. So in other words, people aren't just being complacent anymore and just kind of going along with whatever process they've been put in. They're thinking critically about what their life looks like and what they want it to look like. And that's giving them the boldness, I think, to change careers and to get on new trajectories and to do the things that they need to do to ultimately land and be in a place where, they get excited for work every day. And we've all been going through that process, and I think it's a really edifying process. And like I said, I think a lot of my friends are in that same boat.
So, in order to appreciate sort of the conclusions that you drew, it's important for people to know the world you were in before they announced there's a pandemic. So, what was your life like before the pandemic was announced?
Yeah, so it was what we would say like a typical consulting life. Okay, so you would get on a plane Monday morning. You would fly to wherever your client was. Most recently, it was a small town outside of Chicago. So I'd get on a plane at JFK or LaGuardia, fly into Chicago, rent a car, drive an hour out to my client, where nestled in the cornfields, there's this $4 billion publicly traded company. So I'd stay there to Thursday, fly back Thursday night, get back really late, wake up Friday, maybe go to the office, maybe not. Have my vacation weekend in New York, as I used to say, and then back onto the client. So yeah, it was a constant cycle of traveling, being not home, and kind of justifying it through, there's this perks, we have nice dinners, or like we get rewards miles, or whatever it may be. So you kind of justify it, and it's not until you take a step back where you realize, like, wow, this isn't an ideal way to be living.
Hey, so when you wrote that during that 2.5 years when I was doing a lot of traveling, 650,000 frequent flyer miles from Knight Ridder to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and to Miami, and then all over the country. When you wrote about when you're on the road and you're in a hotel, once you get done with that fancy dinner, you have to go back to an empty hotel room. And we'll come back to this in a second, but that notion of how empty that hotel room is, not just in terms of, physically empty, but there are no relationships to build when you're in an empty hotel room. And I think a lot of people, once the pandemic hit, they began to really look at that moment in their traveling life and realize just how, I hate to say the word empty again, but just how empty it really was. And so the pandemic gets announced. Price Waterhouse does what that causes you immediately to be working from home? Tell us about how sudden that was.
Yeah, it was interesting. I flew back from Chicago, and on the way back to the airport, my boss, he texted me. He was like, "Hey, don't think we're going to travel next week. We just want to see what this COVID thing is." And this is like early March 2020, so right before everything shut down. It's like, yeah, let's just take the week, in New York, and we'll see what happens. And then it was like 2 days later that he texted like, "Hey, we're not traveling anymore." Maybe a day after that the firm said no traveling anywhere. And then maybe a day after that New York completely shut down, restaurants and everything. And I was living by Times Square at the time. And I'll never forget the morning that everything closed down, I walked to Times Square and all the lights were on. It looked very normal, except I was the only person in Times Square. So, immediately those images of like the apocalypse or like I Am Legend start popping up in your head. And you're like, what are we about to experience? And then I think it was maybe a week after that I flew home to Biloxi to stay for a couple months.
Yeah, it was fun to have you here. By the way, we never, again, one of the benefits of the pandemic is we got to spend incredible quality time with you. But the city's gone through a lot of adjustments during this time, and if you were to sort of describe it, so once eventually you went back to New York, and it continued on in that kind of very relatively quiet existence. You were finding ways to eat outside and do all of that, but it was a weird place for an extended period of time, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was interesting because it was just a completely different city. There was no restaurants to go to for a long time, and then when you could, it was outdoor eating only. And in the winter, obviously, that's not prime. But what was interesting about it is everybody who came back to New York, there was such a community around that, of people who wanted New York to flourish, wanted to be in the city, no matter what the city looked like. So what it created, I think, was a lot of strong friendships, because whenever we were getting together, it would be, in apartments or on somebody's front porch or on somebody's rooftop to create that community. So yeah, it was an interesting kind of stage to be in.
And that sense of community, that building of community, those experiences, and all of the incredible realization that this part of life is really important. And when you can contrast that with that empty hotel room during the week, that you're starting to define quality of life. And we'll continue the learnings here when we get on the other side with my son, Justin Mathews, who lives in New York City. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to Coast Vue. It's a treat for me today because I have my son, Justin Mathews, who works for PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers in New York City. He lives in the West Village. He loves the city. He recently wrote a piece called A Truly Hybrid Way of Working. Sent it to me and asked me to read it. And I thought, wow, it's way more specific. I mean, his ability to describe it and his friends' ability to describe their learnings during the pandemic about why it is important to really find real work-life balance. That's a big issue. You heard Jay Spain talk about this yesterday, that all of his friends, all young people, are wrestling with this, and we better come to grips with it because people are changing jobs based on this criteria. And I thought it was a great transition, incidentally, Justin, as you began to talk about how all these friend groups, you have numerous friend groups, how you would come together and socialize during the week, during the pandemic, because you're working remotely. So, I mean, the contrast between what you were learning about that part of life relative to the empty hotel room that you went back to when you were on the road, there couldn't be a more dynamic contrast that you were really beginning to understand, could there?
No, and I mean, and to take that now in the modern day, we've been working remote now for almost 2.5 years. And if I look at my routines in life, right? So I wake up every morning and I go to my gym. And then I walk through the village and come back to my home. In the afternoons, I'm, as you know, pursuing acting as well on the side now. So I'll do an acting class, or I'll do an acting self-tape. Maybe on another day, I've gotten really involved in my church. So I'll have a small group or a Bible study, or I'll go get coffee with somebody from that to kind of minister to them. So it's interesting because my life now it's been broadened so far outside of just work. Whereas before the pandemic, my life was really dedicated to my job, which really, when I look at my vision for life, even when I was young, it never included a full dedication to my role. It's such a more beautiful life and such a more full life now. And it's because we've been working remote for this long and have that freedom.
It is really incredible. Of course, your mom and I have watched this whole thing sort of unfold. And as a result, you view yourself as a more complete human being. I mean, even in fact, the way you describe success is even different now, because the relationships that you gained and what you've learned from those various people, so many different people and so many different friend groups, has made you a better person today. Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun watching you do a little bit of modeling and do a little, go to some acting classes. You actually were an extra on the Marvelous. Say it again. Marvelous Maisel.
Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So I've watched a little bit of it, but But that's been fun, and you would have never had that opportunity that had you been on the road doing what you were doing. Um, but the bottom line is a more complete life. But then but you're not you're not a proponent that you stay in that remote mode, because you also simultaneously learned that relationships at work were just as important, especially working on projects, were just as important as the relationships you had in your private life. And what you were a proponent of now, and what you wrote about, is finding the balance between those work relationships and those not at work relationships, and why they were both important. But what did you simultaneously come to grips with as it related to work?
Yeah, what was interesting is, I mean, for all these reasons, right, I've preached the gospel of working remote since the pandemic, because I absolutely cherish the amount of freedom I have in my schedule and the amount of work-life balance I've discovered. But yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we traveled for work for the first time. Went to a state nearby for one trip, and then DC for the next trip. And in those 2 weeks, I got to reconnect with colleagues. I got to get to know my clients better. And what happens when you're sitting around the table with a client or your colleagues, you build trust, right? You look each other in the eye, you tell stories about what they care about outside of work, and the relationship grows stronger. So then you step away from that and you're back working remote. Now all of a sudden there's a rapport there and there's a relationship there that is stronger and more solidified and more foundational than it was before you were in person. So what I realized is that working remote is, as I think, the primary model, right? I think working remote, having this work-life balance, is really, I think, the best way to accomplish what we want to accomplish. And also, we should be traveling together. We should be coming together on a regular basis, whether it be monthly or bi-monthly, to build relationships, to collaborate as a team, and maybe solve a specific problem or plan for something that needs to happen. But the relationship piece is that core component. And that's what I've kind of discovered, is that I think a truly hybrid way of working allows you to both have that work-life balance, spend that time with your family, do the things you love outside of work, and also build the strong relationships that ultimately make you better at your job and make the job, happen more successfully.
Yeah, I don't. Here's the interesting thing. The thought that came to my mind as a former CEO, I often said we spend more time at work with each other than we spend with our families. And so we need to get along and we need to work together. But I don't really, now that I think about it within the context of what you're saying, is that I don't think I fully appreciated that it's almost as if work was the only thing that mattered.
Yeah.
and we didn't have a deep enough understanding for what was going on at work. Because one of the anecdotes I read, for example, was that this guy had worked remotely, and he was a little bit older and had older parents, and he was spending more time helping his elderly parents, and maybe a kid with some challenge or whatever along the way. But the point was that was now really important to him, and that didn't mean that he wasn't going to be unbelievable in his job. In fact, in order to be unbelievable in his job, he had that peace of mind that he was doing everything he needed to do to help his parents, and these other drags on his life, that if he were to have to go back to the office, those things would keep him from being good in his job working in the office. And he was determined that he would leave his job if he had to. And by the way, this was the CFO for a company.
Wow.
And the CEO decided, go to the farm. You're more valuable to this company. Go to the farm and work from there, and we'll make this work. And it's worked magically. But a lot of companies have not had the wisdom, have not really understood this. And as a result, people are leaving their jobs. And it's really compelling, actually, that you said of your main work group that you're the only one who hasn't changed jobs. That's unbelievable, really.
Yeah, it is. I think the question that's being asked right now is, does it have to be this way? And I think it's the first time that question is so relevant and so, it's so a part of our culture. I know a lot of my friends continue to ask that, right? Do I love this job? No. Well, does it have to be that way? Do I love going to the office every day? No. Does it have to be that way? And the answer is no, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think the more companies ask this and organizations ask that question, the more we'll be able to evolve out of any old habits that are holding us back from being most successful as a company, as a worker, but also as a person as well.
So, of course, this again, the reason I keep coming back to Jace Payne, because he brings this up as something that young people in coastal Mississippi talk about. And if you were talking to an employer who's maybe wrestling with this, what would you talk directly to them about the considerations that they ought to have top of mind as they think about how to stop brain drain, losing our young people who feel like they have to leave Mississippi, how flexible they ought to be, the things they need to be thinking about so they can really, really be focused on quality of life. And that means having good work-life balance. What would your message be?
Yeah, I think for people who have been in their jobs for a really long time, the question I ask is, you've been doing this the same way for a very, very long time. But again, does it have to be that way? I think a lot of people I know who are maybe been in the job for 10 or plus years, they want to go back to the office or they want to go back to traveling, but that's just because that's what they're comfortable with. And I think it's important to kind of examine our own lives and say, yeah, but is this bringing me the most fulfillment? Is there things that I'm missing out in life because that's my approach? Because I guarantee you that's the questions your employees are asking. And that's a lot of the reason why people, I think, are leaving jobs right now, is they don't feel like there's a connection between maybe the millennial and lower generations and the above generations who have been doing it for a really long time. Because you got to understand, our perspective is 2 to 5 years into these jobs, some even less than a year into these jobs. So we don't believe it has to be any certain type of way, because this is all fresh. And we've now grown up in an era where we are working remote, where we're examining ourselves, and where we have a lot of job opportunity to go to if we need to. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I think that for organizations, it's really important to say, yeah, we want it to be this way, but are we more successful as an organization giving the workers what they need and allowing them to then contribute in the way they want to contribute? Because ultimately, I think it's made a lot of us a lot more productive and a lot more successful at our careers.
And the other thing is, Justin, and we've talked about this before, but there are classes, literally classes on how to manage millennials. And millennials are not as married to specific companies anymore as much as they are married to some sense of satisfaction, however they define it. But a lot of instant gratification. They're willing to turn on a dime. Technology, by the way, enables accountability in ways we didn't have before. So it's not like they're going to run from responsibility. They can't. You feel as responsible as you ever did. When we come back, I'm going to ask Kyle to kind of join in the conversation a bit, and we'll just continue the conversation, have a little bit of a roundabout on this last segment. We'll see you after this break with my son, Justin Mathews. Welcome back to Coast Vue. Having a terrific conversation with my son, Justin Mathews, who works for PricewaterhouseCoopers in New York City, and he's doing international treasury work, finance work. And he wrote a piece called Truly Hybrid Way of Work, essentially sort of a catharsis in a way of what he learned about the importance of work relationships as well as, life relationships outside of work, and why, especially millennials, why this has become incredibly important, and that we better pay attention to it, because if we don't pay attention to it, we may lose some of our best and brightest. Justin, one of the things that we talk about here in coastal Mississippi all the time is that with the new economy, the day of just going to get a big factory and hoping they relocate there and then bring in jobs, those days are numbered. And where there's a lot more focus today on building the kind of places that young people want to live. Because in this remote and hybrid work world that we live in, they can actually choose the community they want to live in. And so we should be focusing on building downtowns that are walkable, that have things to do, that can, create sort of the opportunity, like you continue to talk about, that you have in New York City, and I just have these friend groups that can come together and socialize with each other and all that. I mean, that's just a reality, but that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah, hugely important. Hugely important. I think we look at the whole person, I think, is how they describe it. But basically, yeah, we look at our whole lives a lot more now, right? And I mean, we're standing on the shoulders of y'all and the generations above us, where there's a lot of hard work, right, to get to this point, to get to a point where I have opportunities now to pursue different careers because y'all put in the work to create that opportunity. So yeah, I think we're coming from a privileged position, and that like we have a lot of opportunity in this world, and therefore the job is important, and creating wealth is important, and all those things are important. Security is important, but so is everything else outside of work. And I think we're examining that more now than ever.
Yeah, there's no doubt the pandemic has changed everything. Hey, let's bring producer Kyle Curley into the conversation. And if you're a regular listener, you know that Kyle and I have talked about this so many times, the realities of how work will change. But, the whole time I'm listening to Justin, Kyle, I'm thinking about past conversations you and I have had. It is, I don't care if you're in New York City or in coastal Mississippi or in Spain. This is a regular, ongoing conversation, especially, it's really widely, I don't care how old you are, everybody's thinking about it, but especially young people, this is a big deal. It sounds familiar, doesn't it, my friend?
Yeah, it really does. And, for some of us, myself included, I think I was ahead of the curve on working from home. And it's helping going forward with the other aspects of my life, not having to spend the time on the road, like Justin was saying earlier, where you're commuting back and forth. You're at home 5 after 5 or 5:35. And I've been doing it for 2 years, and it's still funny to walk 15 feet into the other room. Honey, I'm home. And it gets a laugh mostly every time, except for when my son here, he's 14. He's just like, whatever. But he's 14. So, but, I think one thing that's not really talked about, and I want to, I don't know if I guess I need to be kind of careful of how to address it. But when you work from home, there's always the aspect of those people that are at the office because they didn't give themselves the same opportunity to do work from home. Yeah. They don't want to do whatever it takes, whether it's, purchasing your own equipment, your own materials to work from home. And they just show up. And then when you for those of us that work at home, you kind of walk in and you're like, oh, hey, what are you doing here?
Yeah. Hey, Justin, that's a good point, actually. Do you encounter people who might not be as willing to work remotely, or is that something you don't encounter?
No, I think there's a lot of people out there who still do want to work in person. And, I think within a hybrid model, they have the opportunity, right, to go work in the office. I have friends that have pinged me in my company that will say, hey, you coming to the office today? And I'm like, heck no. Because I like to go, if there's a defined purpose, I'll go into the office. We'll build those relationships. It'll be great. But yeah, I think an important aspect of all of this is that we all have our own values, right? We have our own things that we care most about. For me, it's faith and family and friends, and then work. For a lot of people, it's not like that, and that's okay, right? It's okay that not all of our values are the same, as long as we're giving everybody the opportunity to cater to their value system and their value proposition to the best of their ability. And for people who don't have the opportunity, I think that's where, it becomes the employer's job to step in and say, hey, look, if this is how you best want to work, we'd rather you work this way than not have you work here at all. And I think that's kind of like the synopsis of all this, right? It's about giving people the opportunity to work in the way that's most effective for them and balances their life best.
Yeah. So Kyle, when you in your situation, you were a bit ahead of the curve, but you understood well even then, and you certainly do today, that we are actually able to do things with this show we wouldn't have been able to do before if we weren't doing it in this format. I mean, for example, having Justin on. I mean, usually we would have had to be in the studio. So this is important, isn't it?
It really is, because, we're taking into the account the guests' time that they would have to drive. And we have guests, we have less than a minute, but we have guests from Jackson County. We have guests from Jackson, from North Mississippi, from Hancock County. And just coming from Hancock County and Jackson County to Gulfport is, depending on that's a good 45 minutes to an hour drive. And then they have to drive back. So the time that they've taken away from work for, say, a 29-minute, 30-minute, episode, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of work. It is.
And that's not work in a relationship building that they're doing. Anyway, Justin, thank you for writing that piece and sort of inspiring this show today. I hope people got something from it. And, you make us proud. Keep up the good work, my friend, my son.
I appreciate that, Dad. I love you.
I love you too, my son. God bless you. And have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.